And we are live on YouTube. All right, we are live. I'm going to start a little house music here just to get us going. If I can find the thing. Okay, getting there. All right, and a little share screen. Wait. Can you all hear that? All right, gonna let everybody in. Well, good evening, everybody. The Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. We're just getting started. We're playing a little bit of Deeper Shades of Affordable Housing. Not really called Deeper Shades of House. But while we're waiting for people to come in, it takes a couple minutes for people to come into the Zoom door. So, we're on, and we'll just wait a few minutes before we get started. Is that better? Too loud? Okay. A little more? Not that loud on my computer. There we are. Those of you who are just joining us, this is the Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. We're playing a little Deeper Shades of House. While we wait for people to come into the door, looks like we have a lot of attendees tonight.
We can't hear you.
Thank you all for joining us. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Somebody will have to remind me to turn the music
It's
off
a black
once we get
face.
going.
You better understand. This thing called house.
If you're just joining us,
It's a
this
black
is the
face.
Renters Alliance
You better
Renter Town Hall. Playing a little house music before we get started. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes.
Deeper Shades of House with Lars Barrow.
You're just joining us. This is the Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. Get started in just a couple of minutes.
Amiri Baraka, Sheikh Anta Diop, Eric Williams, Neely Fuller, J.A. Rogers, Carol Taylor, France Fanon, Chancellor Williams, Walter Suzulu, Nat Turner, Shaka, Angela Davis, General Mugmug, WLIB, MGT and GCC, FOI, Peter Tosh, Stokely Carmichael, Miles Davis, Max Roach, Montague Carr, Larry Doe, Isa, Mansa Musa, Muammar el-Gaddafi, the Ayatollah Khomeini, Stephen Biko, Prophet Muhammad, may peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, Walter Rodney, Kwame Nkrumah, Ivan Van Sertima, Dr. Francis Chris Wilson, Juwan
Okay.
Youth,
Good evening, everybody.
the Honorable
This is Matt Losak. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Montgomery County Renters Alliance. Tonight, we have a very interesting discussion focusing on Thrive 2050, as well as other issues related to renters. A couple of housekeeping things. One, if you have any questions or concerns, we will get to them best we can, but please put them in the chat. That's where all of the attendees' questions and concerns should be placed, in the chat. With me tonight is Pat Beckham on the Renters Alliance staff, Malek Demir, and David Mullins, who will be monitoring the chat and will help assist in providing information and making sure that best we can, we address these questions and concerns. We have a number of special guests with us tonight and experts. We have with us Tanya Stern, the acting director of the Montgomery County Planning Department, and also Nicole Catravanos, the manager of the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs. We will also be joined by Councilmember Will Jawando, who will get to us a little bit later after we have an opportunity to hear an overview of Thrive 2050 and how it relates to renters from Ms. Stern. Let me just give some opening remarks on what I think is going on. There's been a lot of controversy about the Thrive 2050, a lot of confusion. And so we want to clear some of that up tonight. It is a larger plan that I don't think has any particular direct relationship to anything that's going on right now. But we'll hear from Ms. Stern in terms of how that relates to renters. Some of the concerns have been whether or not the planning of this document included enough constituencies to give input. Some say yes, some say no. Renters Alliance doesn't have a particular position one way or the other, but we do believe that it relates in some ways to housing in Montgomery County, to the various narratives about how to achieve affordable housing in Montgomery County. And so we think we have an interest in at least understanding it. So we have encouraged through our newsletters for you all to listen to the various points of view. County Executive Mark Elrich has been very critical of the document, and his remarks were in our newsletter, and you can go to his YouTube remarks and listen to his critiques. Likewise, the County Council voted unanimously yesterday to pass the Thrive Plan, so clearly they have a different opinion. We will have Councilmember Will Jawando on to give his point of view. Councilmember Jawando is a very strong advocate for renters' rights, for affordable housing, for rent stabilization and quality, affordable, stable rental homes. So we believe that he will be a balanced point of view with regard to how the Thrive 2050 relates to the renter community today and in the future. So with that, then let me turn to Ms. Tanya Stern, who, as I say, is the acting director of the planning department here in Montgomery County. Tanya, thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Matt, for this opportunity to talk with the Renters
We
Alliance.
can't hear you for some reason. Let's see why. Is your...
I went off mute.
Nope.
I
nope,
can
nope,
hear.
Maybe.
We're able to hear, I think.
Yeah, we can hear.
I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, except the music's back on. So let me turn off. I told you we're going to rock and roll with this. Hang on a second.
We got no music.
Hang on.
He does, yeah.
We'll get there. All right. Now, do a 1, 2, 3, Tanya.
1, 2, 3.
I can hear you. Can everybody hear Tanya Stern? All right.
Excellent.
That's what we get for having a little fun in the beginning. Okay. Ms. Stern, please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you again for this invitation to talk about Thrive Montgomery 2050 to the Renters Alliance. Again, I am Tanya Stern, acting deputy, excuse me. I'll explain why I just said that. I'm Tanya Stern, acting director of the Montgomery County Planning Department. I've been in this role for now almost 3 weeks, but I've actually been with the planning department for 4 years. Previous to my current role, I was deputy planning director, overseeing 5 of our divisions, including a division that produces our housing policy, which is reflected in Thrive Montgomery 2050. Prior to working for the commission, I worked for the government of the District of Columbia for 14 years, including 8 years at the DC Office of Planning as chief of staff and deputy director there. And prior to my time in district government, I also worked in a nonprofit sector for a number of years as well. So that's a quick overview of me. One other thing I forgot to mention, I am a 3rd generation native Washingtonian. So DC is my hometown. And so I'm very happy to serve the DC region in the different capacities throughout my career. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into my presentation. I'm going to share my screen. Give me a second. All right, let's to presentation mode. All right, can everyone see my slides?
Yes.
Great. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right into it. What is Thrive Montgomery 2050? Thrive is the update to the county's general plan. The general plan is the long-range vision for the future of growth in Montgomery County. The last time we comprehensively updated this plan was in 1969. So it has been over 50 years since we have had this high level vision for the county and for how we will manage our growth into the next few decades. So that is really the role of Thrive Montgomery 2050, which is to lay out an updated vision for the next 30 years of this county. One thing I did want to note up front, because this is something that comes up, it does not change zoning in any neighborhood in the county. Again, Thrive is a high-level policy plan, and the role of Thrive as a general plan is actually to provide guidance for future planning, both countywide policies on housing and transportation, future master plans that we create for particular communities in the county, as well as countywide master plans, such as the pedestrian master plan we're doing right now. Thrive's policies will also influence planning for future infrastructure by both the public and private sector. It will influence decisions on community amenities and will provide guidance that will shape private development. So this is kind of an illustration of how the general plan, Thrive Montgomery 2050 as a general plan, relates to the other types of planning and development review that my department, the planning department, is responsible for producing in terms of the plans, and they're reviewing and making recommendations on development projects. So again, Thrive is an umbrella plan. It sets up the framework of policies that in turn will have more tactical, more strategic, more detailed strategies and functional master plans. Those are the countywide plans that I mentioned, as well as in area master plans, where we can come up with more tailored recommendations depending upon the specific needs of different parts of the county. And then all of those plans in turn will provide a guidance that will influence development review of private development projects in the county. So Thrive Montgomery 2050 has three key objectives or key pillars: economic health, community equity, and environmental resilience. And one thing I wanted to note is that Thrive is the first general plan for our county that specifically identifies community equity as a key objective. And equity is a key focus that shows up throughout the plan. There is a specific chapter that focuses on it, but it is something that underlies a number of the policies throughout the plan. One other thing I wanted to also note in terms of the focus on equity in Thrive Montgomery 2050 is, as I'm sure a lot of you know, Montgomery County is a very diverse county in terms of the racial and ethnic makeup of our residents. Back in 1990, the county was over 70% white, but as of 2020, from the most recent decennial census, our residents are over 59% people of color. And so it's really critical for us to make sure that all of the policies that will shape the county's future is very mindful and speaks to the needs of our diverse population. So this is the structure of the actual plan. It has an introduction, and then it goes into 3 chapters focusing on what we call the 3 E's, those 3 pillars of Thrive: economic competitiveness, racial equity and social justice, and then environmental health and resilience. And then the rest of the plan has 6 policy chapters. They are compact growth, which lays out the overarching vision of Thrive in terms of focusing future growth and development on corridors. We also have a chapter that talks about complete communities, and I'll explain what that is in a moment. We also have a chapter on design, arts, and culture, transportation and communication networks, housing for all, which I will definitely speak to, and then a chapter with recommendations related to parks and recreation. And then there's a conclusion chapter that it talks about how Thrive will be implemented. One thing I wanted to note, I just talked about Thrive's compact growth chapter. Again, a particular focus of Thrive, sort of a fundamental premise of it, is that we need to stop sprawl in terms of future development and make sure that we channel and direct that development to the places that are most appropriate in the future. And those are corridors. Those are areas that either already have transportation networks, including transit, or where it's planned in the future. And so you will see on this map, this is the map that shows different levels of growth that Thrive identifies to help guide these decisions in the future. And basically, the area that is the lightest blue color, that is the area that we have identified as where corridor focused growth should take place. That is the parts of the county where the most more dense development should take place in the future. And then as you go further out, that's where that level of growth should start to step down. So again, complete communities is another particular focus of Thrive, and it lays out this idea that, you know, different areas of the county, whether it's in a more urban area, such as downtown Silver Spring, or a more traditional suburban community, or even in the rural parts of the county, that in the future, we shall look to how we can create communities that will have a mix of uses, whether it's housing, jobs, retail, and services that are close to each other, that residents can get to in a very short time period. We use this idea of 15-minute living as a guiding principle. In some contexts, that could be a 15-minute walk. In other places, you may not be able to walk in that amount of time, but the idea is that we want to create these more balanced communities that, depending upon the particular context, you know, what that will look like will vary. But the idea is that we want to make it easier for residents to get to amenities and services very quickly. And so now I'm going to talk about the housing chapter in Thrive, which is called Housing for All, More of Everything. And that is essentially what Thrive really emphasizes in terms of housing and speaking to the housing needs of this county. So a critical issue that we're dealing with is the fact that we simply do not have enough housing units in this county to meet the demand. This chart shows in the purple the number of building permits for housing units that have been issued, you know, going all the way up to about 2021. But if you look at that blue line, that is our population, and you can see it's been increasing over time. And then it's extended by that sort of dashed red line. That is a population forecast that we developed working with the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments that forecasted that our population, which is already over 1 million residents, will grow by up to or close to 200,000 more residents by 2050. So, but what we recognize is that we don't have enough housing units being produced right now to meet existing needs, to meet the existing population already live in this county. And so if we don't continue to focus on this, that issue of housing shortage will just grow into the future as our population grows. So Thrive is really, really focused on increasing housing supply as a sort of a fundamental premise of its housing policy. So now I'm going to talk a bit more about what Thrive talks about in terms of its housing policies, sort of what do we mean by housing for all? And a key part of this is that, you know, Thrive speaks to the fact that access to safe, affordable, and accessible housing is a basic human right. And so we have a number of policies that speak to how we can use a variety of tools to increase the production of more housing, which I just talked about, both subsidized and market rate housing to meet demand. We also want to plan for a wide range of housing types and sizes because we need multiple types of housing choices because our residents have different types of needs at different price points at different times of their life. We also want to promote racial and economic diversity and equity in housing in every neighborhood. And we also want to develop strategies to minimize gentrification and displacement, but also avoiding concentration of poverty, which is already an issue in certain parts of the county. So Thrive does speak specifically to rental housing and how we can protect housing for renters and look after the needs of renters. Thrive talks about strengthening the county's protections for renters through investments in the quality of rental housing and in code enforcement, as well as, again, increasing access to affordable and safe housing. It also talks about protecting and increasing tenants' rights and making sure that renters' contributions to the community are emphasized and valued. Thrive also talks about the need to evaluate methods to maintain affordability in rental housing. And then also it emphasizes supporting and strengthening housing code regulations and tenant protections so that we can have fair housing in this county. And so some of the tools to do this is, again, code enforcement. increasing housing production, including affordable housing, the preservation of naturally occurring affordable housing, again, strategies to minimize gentrification and displacement. And Thrive also talks about community land trusts as another tool that we could use. And one thing I wanted to mention at this point is that prior to our work developing Thrive Montgomery 2050, the planning department conducted a number of housing related studies over the last number of years. A more recent one is the preservation of affordable housing study, which included talking about naturally occurring affordable housing. We've done a rental housing study, a missing middle housing study, a senior housing study, a housing needs assessment study. So we really have looked at this issue very, very closely. And so a lot of the policies in Thrive related to housing, including rental housing, is really informed by a lot of that research and analysis that we've done in recent years. So lastly, I wanted to note that in addition to the policies that are in Thrive, the document also talks about the need to actually track our implementation and to see how well we are actually meeting these policies over the next number of decades. And so Thrive lays out a number of metrics, a number of indicators that we will be monitoring. And some of the ones that relate to housing, including looking at the number and proportion of cost burden households, broken down by race, income, and age, rent and mortgage payments as a proportion of household income, what are the number of affordable units, and also how well are we doing in terms of preserving naturally occurring affordable housing. So as Matt noted, yesterday morning, the County Council approved Thrive Montgomery 2050. So what's next? One thing I want to really emphasize is that while this plan is approved, that the real work is actually just starting. Again, Thrive is a high-level policy plan. It relies on a number of other steps in order to implement its policies. But in the short term, the next procedural step is final adoption by the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, which the planning department is a part of. That's a procedural step for all of our plans. And then over the next year or two, we are actually going to be taking the initial list of metrics that is in Thrive Montgomery 2050 and building that out so that we can have a very robust system of tracking and evaluating implementation. But in terms of the long term, Thrive as a general plan will be implemented over multiple decades through future master plans, zoning tax amendments to change the zoning code, and, as well as other regulatory changes through the capital improvements projects. That's the process that the county uses for publicly funded infrastructure, through private development as well. And a lot of these steps will involve and will require public input. And so it's really important for the renters who are part of the Renters Alliance to stay involved, to sign up for the projects that our department is doing, but also to stay involved in other efforts in the county to implement Thrive's policies. So that concludes my presentation. I strongly encourage you all to go to our website, montgomeryplanning.org, to learn more about our department, and to go to thrivemontgomery.com, which is our dedicated website for Thrive. And there is a huge amount of information on our website, so I definitely encourage you all to go there. Please stay in touch with us on social media, and my contact information is available as well. And I also shared my slides with Matt, so that is available to be distributed as well if folks are interested.
Thank you very much, Tanya. And I'd like to point out again that given the recent rock and roll over at the planning department, you have done yeoman's work taking the reins and managing this process through substantially competing points of view on this plan by very powerful and vocal people. And so that takes a little bit of a steady hand, and I congratulate you on that. Staff, and I'd like to point out our board member and treasurer, Josh Fisher, joining us.
Good evening, everybody.
Staff, what do we have in terms of comments or concerns that Ms. Stern could address? David?
I saw one question about permits, maybe related to the graph with the population and then how many issued, about whether some have been issued and then not being used. And I see Josh here, that we just had a meeting in Gaithersburg, and it came up during that meeting that there were folks that were going to build at the Kentlands that were waiting. It just came up during the meeting. We're waiting for the rents to go up before building. It seemed implied they already had some permits. So I was curious if you wanted to comment on that.
I don't have specific data related to that, but there are instances where projects may get permits, but it may not move forward for a variety of reasons. But I think that is not the sort of majority of the situation. That the simple fact is that the number of permits being issued in terms of the number of housing units that can come out of that, even if, say, the majority of them do get built, they still fall short to the actual needs that we need. So that's really the issue that we're dealing with. There's a big gap between the demand for housing, both from existing residents as well as future residents, and then the number of housing units that are actually being produced.
Ms. Stern, I'd like to know, well, our participants would like to know, how does these plans fit in with persons with disabilities? Will there be accommodations in the planning for those people, those renters?
So Thrive does talk about in the housing chapter, making sure that the types of housing that is built in this county in the future will meet a variety of needs, and that does include people with disabilities. And so it's not just rental housing and market rate housing, but it speaks to residents who have different needs in their own personal lives, and making sure that the housing supply that is built will actually meet a variety of those needs. So there's a lot of different types of housing options that Thrive, recommends, making sure that we can include in our housing supply. It might be single room occupancy, units for those who may be, formerly unhoused residents. So it speaks to a lot of different types of housing needs and making sure that we can meet those, including those with disabilities.
I see a number of comments in there talking about the issue that county executive has raised about there being between 45 and 85,000 permits available for housing to be built. Can you comment at all, Tanya, is this in your lane, about the availability of that building to go on within this plan? Does it relate in some way?
So what we have heard is, in terms of the critique, is that the zoning capacity is sufficient to meet future housing needs. And our department did a residential capacity analysis that looked at, if you just looked at the zoning, what are the theoretical number of housing units that could be built under that zoning? And so I think some of those numbers got pulled from that study. But the important thing to keep in mind is that zoning capacity is simply a maximum. It's an envelope, but it is not the same as what actually gets built in the county on a particular site. There are sites in the county that, and I'm just speaking hypothetically here, for example, where the zoning may allow up to, let's say, 100 feet with a certain number of housing units to go with that, but due to a variety of factors, whether it's market conditions, construction costs, and other factors, site constraints, that site may be built with a building that's only 50 feet. And so I think that's something to really keep in mind. Zoning is a maximum. It is not a guarantee that what can be built there will be built there at that level. And so we can't rely simply on what the zoning will allow and the sort of theoretical capacity to make sure that we meet all those needs. We still need to look for opportunities to expand housing, to be able to produce more housing. There are parts of the county that I'll take, for example, the location where our department used to be in downtown Silver Spring. That was a government-owned office building for decades. It is now a mixed-use development that is under construction that includes a lot of housing units that did not exist there before. And so that's where we have to be a lot more flexible in making sure that we look at a lot of opportunities and a lot of different ways to expand housing, but solely looking at the theoretical capacity under existing zoning is not necessarily going to get us there.
Okay, well, that's way above my pay grade, but it'd be an interesting discussion to have with experts like yourself and others, not me, who are experts on this. We'd like to see that conversation continued. But building on that, I see a question here about generational wealth and how people, I think everybody understands in the renter world that buying a house in downtown Silver Spring is pretty much out of reach these days for the middle class and certainly working families and low income families. The house that was available 20 years ago at $90,000 in downtown Silver Spring is now between $500,000 and $600,000 and just out of reach. And that's a national trend where once housing was available to working families, it's for purchase, it's not available now. What does Thrive do to fortify the idea of starter homes or the idea of building wealth for people through housing? Can you address that, Tanya? Is that
Certainly
in your wheelhouse?
Yes, it is. So as I mentioned, Thrive's housing chapter is called Housing for All, More of Everything. And the more of everything is not just we need more housing units, period, but we need housing that residents can purchase, including starter homes, making sure that we can actually build a variety of different sizes of homes so that people are able to get into the housing market and have some other options that they can actually afford so that they can start to build that generational wealth through home ownership. Thrive very much talks about home ownership in that way, as a way to further equity in this county through building generational wealth. So that is very much an important part of Thrive as well.
And Ms. Stern,
Are there any other key questions for Ms.
Yes.
Stern? We do have with us Councilmember Jawando, who is jumping from event to event like any good politician will do. But Pat, what do we got next?
I would like, one of our participants would like to know as well as I, how do you define affordable renting? renting?
Sure. So we define, or rather Thrive defines affordable housing
Right.
as both subsidized housing as well as housing at reduced rents or sales prices. So that's the focus. It's very much focused on income restricted housing, whether again it's subsidized or at reduced prices.
Thank
Okay,
you.
there are lots of more
Thank you.
comments in here, and Tanya, if you want to stay on and address them in the chat, please do. But in the interest of making sure that we have provide some time for Councilmember Jawando, let us welcome him now. For those of you who don't know Councilmember Jawando, he sits on the Planning, Housing, and Economic Development Committee. He is the leading sponsor to the first and only rent stabilization bills in half a century in Montgomery County that were passed on an emergency basis. Unfortunately, they have expired as of May 15th, but he has put forward another one and has been working closely with the Renters Alliance to advance renter protections throughout the county, a real friend and champion of renters' rights, and someone who grew up in rental housing and knows exactly what it's like when your housing is at risk. Welcome, Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you, Matt. I don't think I need to say anything now. I can just, just bow out. But no, thank you for having me, Matt. And it's good to see all your great leadership of the Renters Alliance and the group and all the residents that have joined. And good to see our acting planning director, Ms. Stern. We'll get you some planning board members tomorrow. So I don't know what the format is. I can talk a little bit. I caught like the last 10 minutes or so of the Thrive discussion. I'm happy to talk about what happened this week as related to renters or Thrive, or what would be most useful?
I think that just to dovetail on Tanya Stern's remarks, we mentioned at the beginning that there's been some controversy over Thrive and confusion. The county executive has been very critical of it, and we urge people to review, as we put out in our newsletter, his remarks on YouTube, raising his concerns, so that people understand that side of
Sure.
it.
Sure.
Yet the council voted unanimously, including yourself, to support Thrive. And so maybe some explanation of why you support it, what concerns you might have, how it will relate to renters today and in the future, just to give us your perspective and perhaps to the extent to which you feel comfortable, the perspective of the council.
Sure. Yeah, that I'm happy to do that. And I also, and I saw your email that went out, as another resource, I'll do before I leave here, unless some of my staff is on, put on the Kojo Nnamdi discussion that we had. I think that's another thing. If your folks didn't see that, I think that was a good discussion from the community side. And obviously Mark and the county executive and I were there, and we shared different views on Thrive, as did Ms. Stern and others. So I think that's another piece of information. As I'm sure Ms. Stern talked about, Thrive's our general plan update, and it'll be a guiding document that more specific plans and policy will come from. And I really took the view from the beginning that, as the planning board worked on it for a period of time and then transmitted it to us earlier this year, that what I wanted to make sure is that Thrive had the tools in the toolbox to address the challenges we face. And as you all know, I am a very big advocate for renters and for affordable housing. And so I wouldn't support anything that was antithetical to that. Now, that being said, the devil is always in the details. And there are laudable policy goals in Thrive that could be achieved in attempts to achieve those goals, like 15-minute living, like more affordable and attainable housing, like transit-oriented development in communities, if they are not done appropriately, could lead to some of the concerns that are raised by critics of Thrive, such as displacement and gentrification. Now, they don't have to lead to that. And that's what I've been focused on is, for example, I think it makes sense to build density and build more around transit hubs because it's good for workers, it's good for the environment, it's good for people that want to get to amenities. But if you're only building high-rise, expensive apartments that no one can afford that don't have subsidies and aren't different types of housing, then you are going to push people out, right? So that's why it's important to make sure we are working with our development community to get deals and approve zoning increases and to have master plans that call for certain levels of affordability. It's important to change our zoning code to allow for different types of housing to be built. It's important to invest in our housing initiative fund so that nonprofit and affordable housing developers can build and compete. And it's important to raise, for example, the amount of MPDUs that we require from development up front before we have to give any money. That's something County Executive and I agree on. I heard there was a discussion about unused approvals. I mentioned this at the Kojo Nnamdi show that we need to review that process by which approvals are given and people sit on them and extend them for years and years and years and don't build the housing. That's something that we do need to look into and see if we can create a different incentive structure. So I see we also need renter protections, right? Just this week, I was trying to pass an extension to those temporary stabilization bills that I passed with colleagues earlier this year. And we had a debate in the housing committee, in the Fed committee, and action wasn't taken. And I doubt action will be taken by this council, but it's a top priority for me with the new council. And I think we have better prospects there. So that's also a part of renter protections being mentioned in Thrive as part of the mix of how we move forward to get this broad vision achieved. So now, for example, if you were to do the opposite, there's some people who say you can achieve Thrive's vision by just giving tax breaks to developers and just letting the market do its will and having very modest requests of them. in doing, that's not going to achieve it. And so I hope you understand what I'm saying is that I see it as my job and our job collectively as council to make sure that we are using the levers we have in the land use and in our policies, in our zoning text amendments, and our laws that we pass to make sure it's a good deal for renters, for low-income residents, as well as residents who need housing across the income continuum. So that's kind of what I would say. And I think Thrive does that. I think it lays out a good vision overall, and that it has the tools in the toolbox. It doesn't bias one over the other. It lays out a lot of options. And then the real hard work that we'll need your help and engagement in is figuring out the right set of policies and tools to use from that Thrive toolbox to achieve outcomes that I think we would all generally agree on in the housing context, affordable housing for everyone along the continuum, which is going to require more housing, but it's how you get there that's really important. So I think Thrive lays out a good vision, and the hard work that we'll need your help with is implementing it master plan by master plan, sector plan by sector plan, zoning text amendment by zoning text amendment, law updates to our laws like the MPDU law and the like. And so that's where we'll need the Renters Alliance and others to be engaged. And that's going to be my view as we move forward.
I think it's very important, council member, that it seems, and again, the Renters Alliance has taken no particular position on Thrive, except agreeing that a wider group of input is important for the success of the plan. But beyond that, the only concern we have with any development plan is that it should not create a narrative that suggests building our way out of rental housing problems, affordability, stability, equity, quality is the only solution. And so I'm glad that you point out that Thrive, in a way, is a two-legged stool if we don't add the third leg of a legal infrastructure that protects renters from rent gouging, from poor code enforcement, and other types of inadequate protections that destabilize housing. Without that, it seems Thrive might not be as effective as it should be, and of course may only lead to gentrification down the road. So I'm glad you raised that.
Absolutely. Yeah, we need, in one of the additions we added after the racial equity report, which also did point out the need for deeper and broader engagement, particularly in our communities of color and low-income communities. I did some outreach on my own as well early on in the process. But in addition to that, the more robust language around renter protections was added as part of the document. And again, I think it gives us the tools in the toolbox to get that done. So I agree. The two-legged stool analogy is a good one, especially in a county where you have approaching 40% of our community are renters, as you.
Yeah, I don't think people hear that enough, council member. Nearly 40% of 1.1 million county residents rent their homes. And that is a trajectory that is a national figure in areas like Montgomery County and Houston and Seattle and LA and San Francisco and New York. More and more people are renting their homes, not as a station on the way to owning, but as a way of life. And so how we look at housing as not just as a common commodity, but as something central to community health, welfare, and prosperity is extremely important, which is why your proposals to stabilize rent, start thinking seriously about a legal infrastructure is so important to so many other aspects of our community health. Staff, what do we got for Council Member Jawando in the chat? Anything for him?
Well, one I would throw out, I've seen come up a couple of times as a public engagement kind of question, which, I mean, you mentioned the devil's in the details, and this is a kind of guiding document. I think people are wondering what, for the public, the next steps of engagement will look like, what the opportunities for them that y'all would recommend for people that want to stay engaged as it gets more down into the weeds would be.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so, and I would ask Ms. Stern maybe to chime in here too. We have a work plan, right? So that the planning department has, which is a public document, which needs to be out there more about when they're doing what, and the way the planning department works is they have a work plan that we at the council approve. Then the commissioner, the planning board members, of which there will be temporary members tomorrow and more members in the future, approve that, and then they send to us that approved document that's been worked on at the staff level and approved by the planning board. And then we have an opportunity to take it up at the council and the committee and then full council. So I don't have it in front of me, but the Fairland Briggs Cheney plan, for example, is going through a public outreach process now. There was a placemaking event that was pretty fun last weekend. There's engagement going on around that plan. I think that's the next one. And then Tanya can maybe talk about what's coming up after that. I do agree 100%, and it was very clear. And I've been raising this for a while. And actually, when we first raised this issue, when we had the public hearings on Thrive, 100 and some people testified. And I made the point at the time that only 2 Black people testified, and they actually knew each other and they had the same perspective. And I said, that's unacceptable. I also raised the fact that groups like the NAACP, for example, and Renters Alliance, others had not been formally engaged in focus groups around the plan. That you can't have that well-organized groups, and that didn't happen, virtual or not. And that was a failure. And so I think going forward, learning from that, we need to institutionalize and set up deeper and more meaningful opportunities for engagement across a broad cross-section of our community, including our most vulnerable and impacted residents, and get real feedback on what's going to happen. And so I think the nitty gritty will be in plans like the Fairland Briggs Cheney plan. That's a master plan that is post-Thrive that should implement the ideals of Thrive, again, which is a vision document, but we'll need to have real engagement with that community. And so that's the way it'll happen. And I'll be looking for that every time, every master plan that comes before us, everything we take up from the planning board, I'll be asking those questions and looking for that process. Tanya, do you want to give a brief on what's coming up next or add anything to that?
Sure. And actually, I will just speak to the question about community engagement and to emphasize that the planning department, through all of its planning projects, we really emphasize equitable engagement as part of our work. We actually have a whole equity and planning action agenda, which is a whole other conversation that I can have, a lot of different strategies we have as part of that. But we have already been looking at, building upon the ways we engage with community members and making sure that we are reaching the broadest number and variety and types of residents in our county. And so we've actually already been engaging in a number of strategies to do that. One example that I will mention is the Fairland and Briggs Cheney master plan that we have underway right now that focuses on those communities in East County, which are, mostly Black and African-American. And I say Black and African-American because they're both African-American residents like myself and also, residents from different countries in Africa as well.
Like me.
Exactly.
Who's both.
Exactly. But one of the things that we have done for that plan, as well as other master plans that we have had underway, is particularly in areas where there are a lot of multifamily buildings. We actually worked with a canvassing company, Everyday Canvassing, and did a whole canvassing effort to knock on doors and to actually go and speak to those residents, in those buildings, and to talk to them about the plan, to get their ideas, what their concerns are about their community. We do a whole variety of different activities to engage residents. We did the Fairland Briggs Cheney Placemaking Festival this weekend, which was another opportunity. We had some fun things where we kind of envisioned what the park and ride site could look like with some, fun temporary placemaking, but we also use that as a way to talk with residents and get their input. We do pop-ups, we do in-person, virtual, we do kind of everything, all the above. We translate documents. But one thing I did want to mention, particularly with the canvassing effort for that project, as well as a similar one that we did for another master plan we have underway, which is the Tacoma Park Minor Master Plan, which also is focused in a community that is very diverse. We collected demographic data on those residents that we reached through the canvassing so that we can see, you know, and looking at the demographics from the census for that plan area, are we actually
Uh-oh.
and so we were able to
Oh, so you're
compare.
back. You're back. You were frozen there for a minute, Tanya. That
Okay.
must be a problem with Texas. Go ahead.
Anyway, what I was saying was is
Uh,
talk to residents to get their input, but we collected. Can you hear me?
Now we can.
Okay, let me try. If I stop my video, sometimes maybe that might help, but you can still hear me talking.
No, you're fine. You're fine. Keep going. Oh, no, you're not. We're in Zoom world.
I know. Okay.
You're
well, I can-
frozen. You're frozen, Tanya. Go ahead, council member.
Yeah, I was just gonna pick up and filibuster a little bit, or not filibuster. If there's another question, but hopefully, David, was that helpful? Was that a helpful answer? Do you want to?
Well, I know I think specifically knowing that the master plans, where they fit in kind of in the hierarchy, which one is coming up at Briggs Cheney, that's super helpful, I think. As far
And
as-
then what we'll do too as a follow-up, and what I was going to ask Tanya to do was we'll send the schedule so that, one part of this is some of it's logistical, like actually planning, like when you don't have a lot of time, like making sure you know what's coming, when the opportunities to engage are, and then, having an opportunity to meaningfully engage in a way that is substantive, right? Because some of this work can be very arcane and, master plans, sector plans, what are you talking about? And I think getting it in a timely fashion where you know what you're talking about and knowing when things are coming up. So there's no hiding the ball here, this is what we're talking about. This is when, and this is how you engage. Tanya, I think you're back there.
Yes, I'm out of town on travel and the hotel Wi-Fi dropped out. Long story short, what I was starting to say is we are not only using a wide variety of tools and strategies to engage with our diverse residents, but we are also tracking and comparing the data based off of who we're actually speaking with, and compare that data to the demographics of the plan area so that we can make sure that we are reaching a representative section of that community, and we're actually speaking to the people who actually live there, making sure that their voices are part of the process. So I wanted to just provide that as background to let folks know that we are very, very, very focused on intentional engagement and intentional equitable engagement as part of our work. But as a council member mentioned, we have the Fairland Briggs Cheney Master Plan underway, Tacoma Park Minor Master Plan. We actually have, I mentioned earlier, a countywide pedestrian master plan we actually have some initial recommendations out right now. We're about to actually write that draft plan. We have a Wheaton downtown study. We're kicking off a University Boulevard corridor study. We have a lot of different projects underway. And so I really, really encourage folks to look at our website, montgomeryplanning.org. As Councilmember Jawando mentioned, when we submit our budget through the county council process, we include with that a work program for the next set of plans or plans and other studies that we want to do with the funding that we're going to be requesting. And so that will be next spring, but we're actually just about to start the budget process, review process once we have a new interim planning board in place. So that's just, definitely look for those opportunities, because you can see what types of projects we have that we want to pursue. And that's an opportunity, for you to give your input as we're developing our work program.
Councilmember Jawando, there's a burning question in there. Just so everybody knows, somebody's threatening to record this. We're already recording it. So it's on YouTube. This is public. There may be press on here. Whatever we say is going out to far and wide. So if you want to write it down and repeat it publicly, you're more than welcome to do so. But the question, I think, is an important one, something that we address from time to time. How do you define affordable housing? I know that the Housing and Urban Development has historically defined affordable housing across the economic spectrum as being able to pay approximately 30% of one's income on your housing expenses. when it gets above 30% of your income, it starts to encroach on what affordability is. We do see some people, particularly seniors and those on fixed income, are seeing a proportion of their income going to housing rising above 50% and higher. And that would be what I believe is known as extremely housing cost burdened. But Councilmember Jawando, do you want to address that a little bit so we can take that off the table?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think you addressed it very well, Matt. And I mean, that is the federal definition, which I think is a good marker. So it's how much you make, right? The affordable housing depends on your income or lack thereof, and it not being, if it's higher than 30%, you start to get into the housing burdened and extremely housing burdened. And I think that is so you look at what's the median, in our context, what's the median income, what's the range of what people are making who are employed. Obviously, we have a different set, of a housing first strategy for those who are experiencing homelessness, and that's an important approach to ending homelessness. But yeah, I think it's what you can afford based on what your job, and we know that wages have not kept up with the cost of everything, and housing is at the top of that list. And so we have, like the rest of the country, dramatic work to do to make that happen. We have our moderately priced dwelling unit program was measured at 65% of area median income, which most would think is, middle class, upper middle class. And as far as making, $60,000 a year or more. And certainly, I think the point there is that you need affordability at every price range, and so when we talk about area median income, one of the things that I've pushed is that when we have a project or a development or something where we have some leverage, we need to be pushing for affordability at multiple levels at, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100% of AMI all the way around. And we need to have units that fall into those categories for everybody. One of the bills I introduced was a bill for when we dispose of public land where we have a bit of leverage, that at least 30% of that public land that's being developed for housing be for low and moderately priced housing, with 15% at a minimum being for 50% or below of AMI. So people making $50,000 or less. And so I think we have a lot of people who are housing burdened. So the goal is to build more housing at more levels and to create different types of housing that can be more affordable. And so, but I would define it as, I think federal government marker is good. But as you said at the Kojo Nnamdi thing, affordable housing is housing that people can afford. And we need that for everybody.
I have a master's degree and that was the best I could do. First of all, our acting planning director, Tanya Stern, has to leave us. She is in Texas at a conference and is off to other activities in Texas, utilizing our public dollars well to keep herself informed and in touch with her network. So we want to thank Tanya Stern for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
And we thank you for your steady hand and for taking over at a difficult time with the planning board. And we hope to have you back because I am sure that we have begun to raise a number of questions and this conversation needs to continue. So thank you, Tanya Stern.
Thank you all so much.
Take care, Tanya.
Councilmember Jawando, on the issue of affordability, we've got the 30% being the thing, but sometimes people confuse that when we hear a term, which somebody referenced, Mark Elrich, saying affordable housing is being able to pay $2,500 a month or whatever. But I think it's important, as you point out, that we have people who are making less than $50,000 a year who live in Montgomery County. And we have people who are making over $250,000 a year who live in Montgomery County. So the affordability of someone's home is across the economic spectrum. And I know some people out there who don't like people who make lots of money. For me, I can't wait to make lots of money. It hasn't happened yet, but I'm looking forward to it. But a person who's making a lot of money and lives in an expensive apartment building in Chevy Chase or wherever that might be, and has rented their apartment when they're 70 years old and now they're 86 years old, and they're in their house lock, stock, and barrel, and they have community roots near their medical facilities, entertainment, shopping, their families. that's their home. And their home is as important to them as it is someone on the lower economic spectrum. The only difference, I think we all agree, is that they might have more options because they have more money, but moving is not easy. And what it does to destabilize communities, even if you're on the wealthy end of the spectrum, is not good. Obviously, we know people on the lower end of the spectrum are much more vulnerable, which is why we look to Councilmember Jawando and others to build that infrastructure to protect the most vulnerable.
Well, you make a good point that I wanted to raise, and it's a perfect segue. One of the reasons I think it's important to have, for example, an anti-rent gouging or rent stabilization policy that applies to everybody and is not means tested is because of what you just said. Someone's home is their home, and everything is relative. You know, you grow to the size of your fishbowl, and you know, if you live in a place, I mentioned this the other day when we were talking about this bill, you know, a middle income married couple who's looking to buy a home and they're renting it and paying $2,500 a month, and good for them. But then they get a notice that their rent's going up to $3,600 a month that they can't afford. That's wrong too. And I think instability in housing is instability in housing, and the market left unchecked will produce that. And it does disproportionately harm our folks at the lower income spectrum, which is why when we put money into building affordable housing, it should be primarily for folks at the lower income spectrum. But when you have a broad law that can protect everybody, it should protect everybody that's being gouged. And so I think you bring up a good point, because one thing I know for sure, and I think all the renters and everyone on this call knows, is that if you have instability in your home, it's not a good feeling, no matter where you live. And one of the things I think that is a connective tissue from all of us in Montgomery County is that it's expensive to live here, and it's hard to find places and to stay in a community when you're rooted. And it's harder for some than others. But I think that we need to build that big tent, so to speak, and to bring in folks who might be middle and upper middle class that are dealing with different types of what we would call, my mother would call, you know, high class problems. But there's still problems for those folks, and it helps us advocate for policies that will disproportionately benefit the people that we need to protect the most. So I think it's an important point.
Yeah, exactly. It's a tide that will float all boats, and the boats that are lower in the water will rise higher. Absolutely. What other questions might we have for Councilmember Jawando, David, Malek, and Pat? Anything out there? I recognize, everybody, that this is one of many conversations we will have on these topics. We won't solve everything tonight, though we always want to. We won't, but we will try to address some of them. Is there anything else out there, folks, before I move on to our next guest?
Well, if not, I'll mention one thing, Matt, before I go.
Sure.
I want to acknowledge Laurel Council member Martin Mitchell, who I was able to join him and some of his colleagues out in Laurel and Prince George County side. There is one block or two in Laurel that is in Montgomery County, but to advocate for a bill that they've introduced to introduce rent stabilization in Laurel. I think we are at a very unique time in history where people understand that this is an imperative. You have activity in Bladensburg. Obviously, we have it in Tacoma Park. There's other municipalities looking at this, other counties. And I think we need to stand in solidarity with folks across the state and across the region and across the country, frankly, to get strong protections for renters and including stabilization. So I just wanted to say I did that this week in Mount Rainier and Hyattsville, as was put in there. So really appreciate that and look forward to coming back and being with everyone again. My email is very easy. It's just councilmember.jawando@montgomerycountymd.gov. If you need anything, any constituents, please reach out and I'd be happy to help.
Well, thank you very much, Councilmember Jawando. You've got a big choir here. So we thank you. The rent stabilization program will be something that we will focus on exclusively on another renter town hall down the road. Obviously, there's a lot of controversy around rent stabilization. We think we can clear that up pretty easy by having these conversations with experts like Councilmember Jawando and others, and hopefully the new council coming in. So thank you, Councilmember Jawando, for joining us yet again, and we will see you soon once more.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Take care.
All right. Next up is our Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs Manager, Nicole Katravanos. Nicole will hopefully be able to give us an update on briefly what Councilmember Jawando was talking about and what took place in the council, and another bill which seems a little obscure, but actually might be very important to a number of renters, having to do with radon. And then other issues, of course, having to do with landlord-tenant and how tenants can seek assistance. Nicole?
Good evening, everybody. Good evening, Matt. Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here. So I'll kick it in with starting with Bill 2222, which is the bill that Matt was referring to and Councilmember Jawando was referring to, and it has to do with limitations on rent increase. This was an emergency bill that was proposed a few months ago. It was proposing that the rent increases be capped at a 4.4%. We had a work group session with the Planning, Housing, and Economic Development Committee on Monday, also known as the Fed Committee. And during that work session, DHCA was present. This bill was originally sponsored by Council President Albornoz by the request of the county executive. So there was a representative also there from the county executive's office. And DHCA is supporting the bill. We don't have a lot of data, which is what was being requested to move forward on the bill. As many of you know, our office, the Office of Landlord Tenant Affairs, is a space where individuals can call via 311 to ask questions. They can send emails via our email intake process, which is at olta.intake@montgomerycountymd.gov, excuse me. And in addition to that, complaints can be submitted to our office. Landlords and tenants could submit a complaint, and at that point, that triggers a fact-finding process and a mediation process, sometimes determination letters, and sometimes hearings in front of the commission. So via those three avenues of information, we did our best to try to collect data on the reports by tenants of excessive rent increases. That report we submitted and we discussed at the work session on Monday. And just to share with you guys a little bit about the findings of the office, we have received a total of 116 reports of excessive rent increases by tenants. And in addition to those, or in those 160 reports, we have received 45 complaints. I'm going to ask for a brief pause. I do apologize. I'm at home with my toddlers, and one of them seems to not be able to live with me. So one moment, and I'll be right back.
You're not alone. David Mullins is also chasing his toddler, both of which are going to end up being landlords, I can tell. Well, take a pause for station identification. Hang on one sec, guys. By the way, just to tag on to what Nicole Katravanos was talking about, the bill did not pass, was expected to be acted on in July, and the council declined to act on it, but did say that they would kick it over to the Planning, Housing, and Economic Development Committee, which then, as Nicole pointed out, had a work session on Monday where they discussed it. Council member and Fed Chair Hans Riemer was concerned that there wasn't sufficient data to substantiate the implementation, whereas Councilmember Jawando said there was basically more than sufficient data to support it. So the disagreements continue. Nicole, you're back.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, everybody. That's correct. So going back to the data that we provided from the Office of Landlord Tenant Affairs, we had 116 reports of excessive rent increase. 45 actual complaints were submitted to the office, with an average of a 24.5% rent increase. What I did do, which I hadn't done before, was pull the numbers as far as how many complaints the Office of Landlord Tenant Affairs gets typically within a year regarding rent increases. And I don't have the exact numbers, but after doing the math, I realized that in the 5 months since the rent cap was stopped back in May 15th, we have received a 200% increase in rent increase complaints. And if we use the complaint process that ULTA has to gauge what the reality of landlords and tenants is in the moment, I think that's very indicative and is a big reason why DHC is concerned and is behind this bill. So as Matt said, nothing has happened at this point. They have asked the Office of Legislative Oversight for more data and more information. And we'll see with the next council members what's going to happen.
Sorry. Oh, yeah. What did I miss?
No,
was
so just
typing.
that I was going to move, unless anybody has any questions regarding that, I can move forward to Bill 2622, which is
Yeah, I think so. Just to say that it's not over, as Councilmember Jawando said. The discussion will continue. If the Planning, Housing, Economic Development Committee does not act on the bill, it is likely that that bill and perhaps a larger, more permanent rent stabilization will be presented to the new council when they come in December. Stay tuned. Obviously, the Renters Alliance is very much interested in whether or not we can get rent stabilization and anti-rent gouging in law in Montgomery County.
Thank you, Matt. So the other bill that I wanted to discuss was Bill 2622. This is a bill that regulates radon testing and mitigation. It was introduced by Councilmember Craig Rice, and we all believe it's a very much needed bill. As most of you may, all of you may know, radon is a gas that's emitted from the earth, and it is the second leading cause of lung cancer for the general population and the first leading cause of lung cancers for non-smokers. And there is a bill that regulates radon in the purchasing and selling of homes, but there isn't anything that regulates the emission of radon in rental properties. So this bill is being proposed as a measure to make landlords or homeowners responsible and to protect tenants. There's still changes, amendments happening to the bill. We had a work session on Monday as well with the Fed committee, and DHA was present. And basically what we did is we went through the bill line by line. There were some amendments made, some suggestions for changes, and it's still in progress. There's nothing finalized at this point. But the essence of the bill is that in order for a landlord to rent to a tenant, at the time where a lease is being signed, they, in addition to the lease, have to submit documentation to the tenant to demonstrate that within the past 3 years, a radon test has been conducted and that the result of that radon test was a certain number. And it seems like that number is going to be 4 in the measurement of how the units of how they measure radon. That number is yet to be decided. And in the lease agreement, there has to be educational information for the tenant regarding radon so that they can be aware and educate themselves. In addition to that, the tenant on their own initiative will be able to test their rental properties for radon. And these are, right now, I believe it's going to be the basement units and first floor units. That's still being decided on as well. And if the tenant finds when they self-test for radon that the result is above a certain amount, then they have an obligation to inform the landlord. The landlord then within 14 days will have to retest to confirm the radon amount. And then if it confirms that the amount is above the required level, then it's gonna have, the landlord's gonna have 90 days to do the mitigation. And so long as the mitigation is successful, the tenant can obviously continue residing there. If the mitigation is not successful, then the tenant will have the right to terminate their lease with a full return of the security deposit and no financial penalties. That's the gist of what the bill is about. It is a protective measure for renters. And the DHCA did go through the bill and suggest some amendments to make it easier to implement and to ensure that tenants have the right to terminate their bill immediately upon receipt of that confirmation press after the mitigation within 90 days. So that's a summary, a little bit of Bill 2222, the rent increase bill, and Bill 2622, which is the rate on bill.
Let me just also compliment you, Nicole. I thought you caught an important part of that bill when you required that the law be slightly amended to include verification that testing had been done. We often forget, we assume that we tell the landlord to do it, they do it, they say they do it, but there's no verification that they did it. And who, of course, is the best person to make sure, who has the greatest interest, but the tenant who is occupying the apartment. So we appreciate that you were thinking of how this is going to work in action for the tenants. Much appreciated. Do we have any questions on either of those bills for Nicole, folks?
I was going to say, I don't,
If not, then David?
I'm seeing assistance questions, but yeah, not necessarily on those.
All right, then let's go to the general stuff. Just update people and remind people of the role of the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs vis-a-vis code, how people can access the services that your department offers.
Absolutely. So two of our offices that are most busiest and that provide services to tenants in the community is the Office of Landlord Tenant Affairs, which is the office that I manage, and the Office of Code Enforcement. We work closely together, but we do provide two different services. So I'll start a little bit with the Office of Code Enforcement. If you as a tenant are having any type of maintenance issue in your property, whether it's something as complex as the property being uninhabitable because of an infestation or because of some kind of leakage or water bursting, you should immediately call 311. You can ask for code enforcement, explain the situation, and they will then send out an inspector to inspect the property. If they do find any violations, they will notify the landlord. They will provide a certain period of time for remedies to be made, and then they will go back out to the property to confirm that the repairs were done. If the repairs aren't done, citations can be issued and follow-through actions can be taken. That is for code enforcement. You can contact them for things as simple as, one of your stove knobs not working, or if you're missing a key to one of the doors in your house, like the back patio door, or if one of the windows are broken, or it can be something, much bigger and much more urgent. It's important that when you call 311 and you file that complaint, that you have detailed information as to what your situation is and if it's urgent or not. The other office, which is the Office of Landlord Tenant Affairs, you can reach out to us via 311, ask for our office, and you will get a call back within 24 to 48 hours. Or you can send us an email at alta.intake@montgomerycounty.gov. We have a group of investigators that are checking those emails every single day, multiple times a day, and they will respond to your inquiries within 24 to 48 hours. I ask that in your emails that you're detailed about your fact pattern so we can best provide you advice and guidance based on your situation. After doing so, after reaching out to us, calling us, emailing us with your questions, if you find that whatever dispute you have with your landlord isn't something that you can mediate on your own, you can file a complaint through our office. It's located on the complaint form is located on the DHCA Ulta website. And that complaint form is downloadable. You can fill it out and you can either mail it to our office or you can email it to us at the ulta.intake at Montgomery County MD.gov email address. And basically, we can provide assistance if you need to mediate a dispute with your landlord. It can have anything to do with security deposits, for example, is what we typically most get. It can have to do with any fees that you're being asked to pay that you think are unlawful or that you think may be excessive or that weren't necessarily a part of your lease. Other disputes sometimes have to do with access to the property. The landlord doesn't have to give you ample notice to be able to access the property. There could be issues with noise violation complaints. Those can be really, really tricky, but we can at least provide you some guidance with that. So any kind of dispute that you're having with your landlord, you can reach out to us. If the dispute has to do with maintenance, one of the things that I listed that typically goes to code. And if the only thing you want is for that maintenance issue to be repaired, then your complaint should only go to code. If in addition to the repair, you're requesting, for example, a reimbursement of some of your rent, or you're requesting to be changed units, or you're requesting to terminate your lease early, at that point, the best course of action is to file an ULTA complaint with us, because we have jurisdiction over the actual negotiation of the lease terms with the landlord, and then we would send a copy to code and send them out so they can actually look at the maintenance and do the maintenance aspect of the case, and we work in conjunction with code.
All right, well, some common questions have come up in the chat. Well, we like them because they are common. They are common problems that come up. So Nicole, could you address the issue that, what would be considered a breach of lease by the landlord? And does that make the lease breakable or null and void, so to speak, as someone said in the chat? What does the term breach of lease mean, and how does it affect both sides of the contract?
Sure. So terminology is important, but I think at the end of the day, what's more important is what's the remedy you're looking for. In court, breach of lease actions are typically only for the landlord, and it's a way to remove the tenant from the property. However, at the end of the day, a lease is a contract, and both tenants and landlords have obligations under the lease agreement. So depending on what the situation is, I recommend that you send us an email at ulta.intake@montgomerycounty.gov. Explain, if you can, attach a copy of your lease. Explain to us what provision of the lease the landlord is not complying with, and then we can best guide you. Multiple times, the Office of Landlord Tenant Affairs, all we have to do is pick up the phone, call the property management company or the landlord, and do a reprimanding over the phone or inform them of their obligations, and then they will remedy it. That's not always the case. Sometimes things will be more complex than that. But at times it can be as simple as an authority figure giving a call and reminding them of their obligations. So please contact us, let us know what your fact pattern is, and we can best guide you.
Well, let me focus that a little bit more, Nicole, on the issue of breaking a lease. We know that one can break a lease with, I believe, as little as 30 days notice if an issue happens beyond the tenant's control. For example, a health issue, one is moving into a nursing home, or one loses a job through no fault of their own, or is called away for military purposes, or some other issue beyond their control. Under those circumstances, one can break a lease with as little as 30 days, but we always recommend that be done carefully with the guidance of the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs, and to make sure that the substantiation for that claim is made in writing. But then the other is what happens if the landlord is not delivering the promised or required services of the lease? What happens in terms of that response?
Well, I mean, it happens often. So sometimes tenants believe that they have certain rights to certain services, and that may not be the case. So the first thing that we always do is go back to the lease, look at the paperwork, see in fact what services are the landlord has committed to doing or to providing, and then go from there.
Okay, so we just, urge you to, you're welcome to consult with the Renters Alliance. We have a medium amount of expertise in this. You can contact us at info@rentersalliance.org and ask your questions, and we'll follow up with you. If we think it's a little bit more serious and requires a little higher level of expertise, we'll refer you to the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs. But by all means, don't do anything rash, and don't do anything without getting it in writing with agreement from your property manager or landlord. You may be perfectly right in breaking a lease, but if you do it without an understanding, you might have a landlord or property manager chasing you for money that you wouldn't have had to owe if you did it the right way. What else do we have, folks?
We have someone in a building, they're doing asbestos and pipe repair work, and they're advising tenants if they have any health issues, they should vacate. So this one tenant feels like she is going to be displaced during that period because of her disability. Are they required to provide her with alternative housing?
Do you know code enforcement has been involved in this?
That would be who she should go to, correct?
No,
So my first step
code.
would be to go to code enforcement.
Code, okay.
Have code go to the property, and they can make the determination if it's going to be habitable or not while they do the repairs.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
If they decide that it's not habitable, they'll essentially condemn the property. They'll make an assessment if it's going to be a short-term or long-term condemnation. And then depending if, the landlord was at fault, or if there was negligence, whether they will be responsible for paying for alternative housing for those tenants.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Anything else, folks? Let
we
me
had
just,
a few- Oh, I was gonna
go
say,
ahead, David.
we had a few
Quickly.
questions earlier just about the wait times of for rent relief. I at least wanted to acknowledge those. And Nicole, as you broke down, your agency's subdivisions, just DHHS is Health and Human Services processing those, not represented today, but I did at least want to acknowledge those questions and that we are hearing that some, and not to put you on the spot, but if you had any comment, feel free, but I didn't want to let those questions go is all.
Sure. So, I don't represent DHHS, I represent DHCA. However, we do work with DHHS, and I know they're doing their best to be able to process all those applications. They're working closely with community organizations. So if you're in an urgent situation, you need your funding, you need the rent immediately, I urge you to please contact one of your community organizations, whether it's Renters Alliance or CASA or LEDC or HIP, because they can help be a stronger voice for you with DHHS when it comes to your COVID rent relief application. And there's still a lot of funds that they're still allocating. There is no concern that they're going to run out of funds. It's just they're having challenges in processing them quickly. And that's about as much as I can say at this point.
Yeah, well, there's a lot more to be said, and we know you can't say it. So we'll leave that to us. We got 2 more minutes before I turn this to our staff member, Pat Beckham, to finish us off. Let me say one thing about 311 and contacting the county. The county is a bureaucracy. It's a government bureaucracy. It does a lot of important and good work. But like any bureaucracy, whether you're calling the cable company or you're calling the county, you need to be in charge of your own communication. You will not always get things working perfectly. We have had tenants who've called 311 recently and were told that a life safety issue that code was going to address immediately would take up to 60 days. That was not true. The 311 operator is not an expert. The code enforcement people are the experts. So you need to be able to do a couple of things. As Nicole Catravano said, please get a record of who you spoke to, get the case number, and make sure that there's follow through. If you don't get the follow through, that's what the Renters Alliance will help you do. So you can contact us at info@rentersalliance.org if you're not getting the response. But like any kind of bureaucracy, track who you're speaking to, write the names down, write down, when they're going to come, when they said they're going to come, and so on. And understand the difference between a 311 operator who's fielding calls from across the county with multiple interests and the actual people who are responsible for certain types of enforcement who have that expertise. The Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs has investigators, and code enforcement has investigators with expertise in those respective areas. So with that, it's 8:30. Pat Beckham, what do you want to tell our renters?
I just want to remind people, please vote. We need it in the legislative. We need people who are sympathetic with renters. So please don't forget to vote. It's important.
And I believe that early voting starts October 27th.
Yes.
For early voting, you can vote anywhere you want where there's a polling station in Montgomery County. Only on election day, November 8th, do you have to vote at your designated polling place. But for early voting, you can vote anywhere. Just find a polling station and get it over with. Renters Alliance was organized to give renters an organized voice in public affairs. We're not an organized voice in public affairs unless you actually get organized and actually get active and vote. That's fundamental. So with that, let me thank Councilmember Will Jawando and obviously our terrific guest, Tanya Stern, the acting director from the Department of Planning for Montgomery County, and Nicole Catravanos, our expert and manager at the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs, my board member, Josh Fisher, and treasurer, who's making sure the money is well spent, and my staff, Malek Demir, Pat Beckham, and David Mullins. And with that, it's 8:30 something. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Vote.